2 weeks ago, we had Representative Khanna on here. In the nearly 5 years that I've been doing the show, the number of congressmen who've wanted to come on GTAA has hovered right around zero. So I thought it was an interesting opportunity to engage with the politician I've always found interesting and talk about some of the stuff we agree about, and also kind of press him on some of the worldview differences. And look, we're generally pretty open to all comers here. If Marjorie Taylor Greene ever decided she wanted to come on GTA, I would have said yes to that too, although it would have been a very different conversation, probably less social democratic policy stuff, more arguing about whether there's secret Jewish space lasers. My position is there aren't, but that is what I would say, right? In Ro Khanna's case, grading on a curve of the U.S. House of Representatives, he's definitely one of the ones I like the most. He was the national co-chair of the Bernie campaign in 2020. His Twitter bio talks about Medicare for all and ending endless wars. And I actually think even relative to some of the members of Congress who call themselves Democratic Socialists, he has taken better than average positions on some issues that are important to me around things like online free speech and promoting a peace settlement to end the war in Ukraine. I've always also respected his willingness to go on shows where people are going to ask him critical questions, which he surely knew was going to include this one. It's a very basic thing, or it should be, but a lot of politicians won't do that. In any case, when he was on the show, I pushed him a bit on the ways Democrats have failed responding to Trump. And I think that's a set of questions he had very solid answers on, and also on what we could do to put Medicare for all kind of back in the conversation, which is a place where I found his answer a little bit less satisfying. I don't doubt his commitment to that issue, but I want politicians like him who are on the right side of it to not just kind of talk about why that would be good, but also, to show me that they've thought about what the plan is. I mean, I'm not even saying to achieve it. I understand there's no one neat trick for overcoming the tremendous resistance that faces any reform that gigantic, right? Something like Medicare for all that about half of Democrats in elected office and every single Republican openly opposes. But I did want to hear a bit more about the plan to at least push the issue forward. And if he comes back on the show at some point, which I have been told that he would be interested in doing, it's something I'd like to take back up with him. What I want to talk about right now, though, is not the politics of what can be accomplished in the next congressional term or the next 25 years even, but a much more basic question that I've been very interested in the years that I've been doing the show and pushing the left to put more focus on, which is, what's our North Star? What's our vision of what a fundamentally more just and equal society would look like? And look, I get that it can feel ridiculous to some people to even spend time worrying about something like that at a time like this. I mean, I just said Medicare for all not only, is not going to happen in the near future, but hasn't even been on the agenda as a subject for debate. It's like for years now. I mean, in 2020, Joe Biden was openly against it. He ran on a public option, which would be great. That would still mean a two-tiered healthcare system for the rich and the poor. But even that proposal disappeared off the face of the earth the moment he was elected. He didn't bring it up in any of his states of the unions or any of the Build Back Better proposals or any of that, right? And now what's actually on the table, now the Republicans are running everything, is do they start slashing Medicaid beyond the grotesque shit that Doge has already been doing? And that doesn't even scratch the surface of the kind of evil nonsense that's been going on. I mean, the Trump administration put a college student legally residing in the United States in detention for 6 weeks in a cell for co-writing a mildly pro-Palestinian newspaper op-ed. And thank God she's finally out, but she might still get deported for it. That is not off the table yet. Stephen Miller, who basically can't open his mouth without reminding me of Vader telling Leia that the emperor doesn't need the Senate anymore because regional governors will govern through fear, is out there saying out loud that if the courts don't, and I quote, do the right thing, unquote, on letting the administration brutalize immigrants as much as they want, President Trump might have to declare that the invasion of immigrants is a real official invasion that could justify suspending habeas corpus, which would mean the military could detain people and they'd have no right to challenge their detention in court. And yeah, they'd only do this to certain categories of persons, but the fun part is that if you're accused of being a member of one of those categories, you don't get your day in court to prove that you're not. So it is somewhat on the honor system, which even floating something like that should be way more of an everything else reaches to a halt while we talk about how insane that is moment for the country. I think there's a solid 95% or so chance that won't happen. But that 1 in 20 chance that's left over should be enough to keep you up at night. So given that extremely grim background about the politics of the moment, I can understand how somebody could say, hell with it. The defense of liberal democracy is all that matters right now. Why are you still talking about all this socialist stuff? Put all that on the back burner. But I think that would be a very profound mistake. To see why, let's start by noticing that there's a reason that Trump became president in the first place. We live in a profoundly unequal society, and one that in the last decades of the 20th century and going into the 21st was hollowed out by deindustrialization, has seen in that time spiking deaths of despair, the opioid epidemic, the Uberization of everything, rising economic insecurity and anxiety. And all of this has contributed to a deep well of populist rage that could have been harnessed in a good left-wing direction, but was instead ultimately harnessed through scapegoating to support right-wing xenophobic authoritarianism. Without understanding that, you can't understand anything about what's happened in the last 10 years with the rise of Trump. And since Trump was elected again for this second, much scarier administration, the most inspiring sign of pushback has been Bernie Sanders and AOC's fighting an oligarchy tour all around the country. You know, hundreds of thousands of people with no previous connection to Bernie-style politics have been flocking to those rallies because, sure, they're horrified by Trump, but they're particularly electrified by the combination of that anti-Trump message with a message that foregrounds the underlying barbarity of economic inequality. And the way the two have come together in an administration where Trump postures as a champion of the forgotten while surrounding himself with tech billionaires. And Elisa Slotkin, who I'm ashamed to say used to be my congresswoman in Michigan, pushed back against the anti-oligarchy tour by saying, oh, no one knows what oligarchy even means, guys. Just talk about democracy. Just say no kings. And this is actually how I opened that article in Unheard I was talking about earlier. The 21st century belongs to Marx, by talking about this because, you know, what I said there is, okay, first, Americans' vocabulary is actually better than Slotkin thinks it is. So most people, this is the first of those two poll graphics, do know that word, and you know, they already know what it means. And then the second one, you know, an even larger majority of people, once they've heard the definition, agree that the shoe fits. It's not actually that big a stretch to start taking the word we've been using for decades to describe shitty rich people in Russia and start applying it to shitty rich people in America. But I also say this isn't, you know, the other thing I say in the article is this is not just an argument about semantics. There's a world of substantive difference between talking about opposing economic oligarchy and just talking about no kings. What Slotkin is saying is only talk about political democracy and authoritarianism. Don't talk about economic hierarchy. And that's exactly the wrong message. If you're going to get people excited, you don't just need to be able to point to whatever horrible thing is going on right this second. You need your own positive vision of how things should be. That much, of course, Khanna and I would agree on. We agree that we should be talking about economic inequality. We agree on a lot of the short-term social democratic stuff like Medicare for all or the PRO Act to make it easier to organize unions. But he wants to get off the bus at a much earlier stop than I do on this trip. And that takes us to the part of his GTAA appearance that I want to revisit today. Jake, let's do the first clip.
You talked about wealth accruing to capitalist class, and given who I am and what show you're on, I really can't not ask you about one of the votes that, you know, I do actually really disagree with you about. And I kind of found the most baffling, right? So a couple of years ago, the House passed a resolution condemning socialism. I wrote about it at the time for the Daily Beast. I think we have that graphic, Jake. So the resolution starts by claiming that, quote, socialist ideology necessitates a concentration of power that has time and time again collapsed into communist regimes, totalitarian rule, and brutal dictatorship. And, you know, we can talk about why I think that's a ridiculous conflation, but here's what I find especially strange about your vote there. In 2020, when the most prominent self-described democratic socialist in the United States ran for president, you were his national campaign co-chair. So
with pride.
What am I missing here, Congressman?
Well, I think that what Bernie is a social democrat. What Bernie is a believer that you should have a universal safety net. Everyone should have health care, Medicare for all, free public college, child care, early childhood education, that there should be fair taxes on wealth to be able to create this kind of society. That is what is just, and that's also an investment in our human capital. That's very different than the belief that the government should control the means of production, that the government should literally run Apple and run U.S. Steel and run companies, which is what I take socialism to mean. Now, I will grant you that there was probably outrageous language in that resolution, but the core point is that I don't believe in the government taking over the means of production. I call myself a progressive capitalist, and I wanted to make that clear in the vote. But I concede that there were probably a parade of horribles, as is often the case, that I wouldn't agree with.
And I really want to take some time to unpack that answer, because I think Khanna is a smart guy, and certainly more thoughtful than most people in his position. And obviously, given the political possibilities of the year 2025, where we are right this second, far more of an ally than an enemy politically. But I also think the disagreement here matters. It matters in principle, and it matters insofar as it's not a coincidence that the Nordic social democracies, for example, were built by the struggles of radical trade unionists and socialist parties, were fired up to kind of stay in that fight for the long haul by a long-term vision that went beyond just achieving social democracy. Hell, the kind of cadres that built up the CIO, right, the militant industrial unions in this country in the 1930s, and did a lot of the yeoman's work and certain parts of the civil rights movement in the 50s and going into the 60s, were socialists and communists inspired by one interpretation or another of that same vision. And look, don't get me wrong, I obviously understand that even if there is a majority of the American public that would get behind reforming our current social contract in a more pro-worker direction to some degree, which I'm optimistic that there is, right now in 2025, there's certainly not a majority of the public behind collectivizing the means of production and putting them under workers' control. But I don't just want to figure out what messaging would land in the next election cycle or the next 10. I want to figure out what we actually want in the long run, both because I think people who have an inspiring long-term vision are going to be the best fighters for short-term reforms, for at least getting to the next couple of stops. And while what I will admit is at this point a pretty strained bus metaphor, but also because I actually do care. In fact, I care quite a lot about staying on the bus well beyond those stops. If you go with that old Gramsci line about the time the old world is dying and the new one isn't ready to be born, being a time of monsters, well, the monsters are all around us. That much is obvious. You can't miss them. But I want to get to that new world sooner or later so we can be done with that time of monsters. So I think the question of what we stand for in the long run matters. It matters a lot. So let's talk about that answer. When Congressman Khanna says, I don't want the government to run Apple or U.S. Steel, my very simple question is going to be, why not? It could be an answer about the economic incentives lining up properly for different outcomes we want. That's a sort of technical, logistical question. An engineering question about how we want socialism to work exactly. I have a book coming out probably next year that I'm co-writing with Bhaskar Sankara and Mike Beggs called The Blueprint. It's all about this exact question. We're still finishing up. But Verso did already do a version of what the cover is going to look like. That's the graphic you're looking at there. But, so if it's just about making incentives work, that's one thing. But if it's a deeper divide, like what we're supposed to think, are we supposed to think it's bad or tyrannical if the government did own Apple or US Steel? Why? Exactly why would that be bad? To whatever extent we have democracy in the political realm, that's the degree to which public ownership actually does mean ownership by the public. If the US Postal Service were sold off to private investors tomorrow, that would mean that ordinary people wouldn't even have the indirect control currently exercised by their elected representatives. Conversely, if U.S. Steel was nationalized or if Apple was nationalized, we'd, to whatever extent we have democracy, that's the extent to which we would all get a say in how it was run. Instead of just a bunch of Apple and U.S. Steel shareholders having a say that's literally, officially, formally proportional to how much wealth they have to invest, which is certainly a system that we wouldn't approve of in the political realm. Wouldn't it be better to extend democracy to Apple and U.S. Steel if we value democracy in general, right? Why does it stop being good when it comes to the governance of those operations? And so, as I was kind of trying to probe him on this question, the next thing I pushed him on was, okay, I want to explore why you think nationalizing these companies would be bad. Is it just about the form that social ownership would take, or is it a more basic objection to taking it away from those private investors? So to try to push him a bit on that, I asked him about a different form that collective ownership could potentially take. This is the second clip.
Some of those companies that you mentioned, you think that it would be ridiculous for the government to own. If we move towards a form of social organization where workers collectively owned them, or that was more the economic norm, would that be a bad thing? And if so, why?
Well, I am for workers' cooperatives, and I have supported expanding worker cooperatives. I've supported expanding, giving workers stock in companies. I've supported giving workers seats on boards of companies. But I guess I do believe that there's room for the eccentric genius, the eccentric person of not just genius but passion to say, look, I want to have the freedom to build something, make something, exchange something without necessarily needing a collective buy-in. I mean, and that is the classic story of a small business owner or an entrepreneur. And to me, that is a freedom, a freedom that we should celebrate while making sure that that workers have dignity and voice and a say and appropriate compensation. But I think it would be a mistake to, not just a mistake in terms of economic growth or productivity, but a mistake in terms of human fulfillment to say that that individuals couldn't have the ability to have thoughts, ideas, plans apart from a majority or a collective that they get to implement. And that's, to me, the defense of why you have a free enterprise. But within it, I do think that everyone needs to have the investment in education and healthcare and fair wages.
And this, to me, is where there's a more fundamental ideological divide. Because again, if we're just talking about making the incentives line up to have a flourishing economy, right? The sort of G.A. Cohen and Why Not Socialism, he says, making the wheels turn, right? That's one discussion, right? And we can talk about different models. And when we talk about building those models, I agree they're competing sort of values or goals you have to balance there. And in the kind of model that Bhaskar and Mike and I develop in the new book, we even talk about ways that you can accommodate some of the kinds of incentives that Congressman Khanna might be thinking of there. If because of economic calculation problems, there are some sectors where you do want to have price signals and firm failure and all of that. At least you could have internally democratic firms, you could have workers collectives. And rather than empowering wealthy investors, you could have the main sort of mechanism for getting new workers collectives going be grants from nationalized banks. And we talk about a setup where you'd have workers would vote not only for the sort of council or whatever that ran the place, but on an operating agreement, which is like a union contract, except it's unilateral, right? There's no boss on the other end of the table. And you could have, look, if you're just worried about, I think we want to take some of this with a grain of salt anyway. I think a lot of the just so stories we tell about technological innovation really ignore the massive role of the state sector in seeding a lot of that in the first place. But look, if we do want to incentivize certain forms of innovation, one way of doing that is you can have the first operating agreement be set by the founders of the firm, so they can sort of temporarily give themselves a lot of the perks that capitalists have in traditional firms. but but then look, the next one up, everybody's going to get to vote on. And so if all you're worried about is incentives, right? I mean, if anything, that gives you more of an incentive to come up with the next great idea. But really, I think the fundamental dividing line there isn't about that at all, right? Because it's about the concern he was expressing about freedom. And the next thing that I was pushing him on in the conversation is look, whose freedom are we concerned with here? Because the objection that socialists have always made to the capitalist system at the sort of most basic ideological core is that if you have the means of production, your Apples, your US Steels, and on down, owned by private individuals, bought and sold like any other commodity, that means that all the people who can't afford to buy their own means of production have no realistic choice except to sell themselves bit by bit, right? Sell themselves for half their waking hours, most days of the week, to people who can't afford it, and thus to be under the economic domination of people who can't afford it. And of course, even outside of the workplace, there are vast numbers of people whose lives are affected by the decisions made by the owners of the means of production. And so the last clip that we wanted to run is the last little exchange we had on this topic before we moved on, when I started to push him about, okay, is this a kind of freedom that you're worried about, right? You're talking about the freedom of innovators to sort of have their idea implemented without having to run it by a collective, but what about the freedom of this much larger group of people who then end up being economically dominated by whoever can afford to buy the means of production? So let's do the last clip.
I think that there is a balance, and you need workplace democracy of some kind as well. Most of the time we spend is at work. Most people in this country, unfortunately, don't like their work. I've read somewhere that 70% change their jobs in 2 years. And that's why I do think that workers should have some form of ownership. I mean, giving incentive to give them some kind of equity, some kind of stock. If workers should have some kind of voice in the board.
So you'd be in favor of like codetermination, like you have maybe for firms of a certain size. You have the kinds of things they have even in Germany, where there's some worker representatives who have to be on the board. Yeah,
I've been on Tammy Baldwin's bill to have a third of the board, have worker representation. I think it's in particular important of labor protections and that kind of worker representation in a world of AI, where we need to see what kind of notice someone would get before being laid off, what kind of severance they would get, what kind of voice they would have, that automation isn't used just to eliminate positions, but to augment people. So I think there is a tension, but I think the tension shouldn't go to the point where individuals, for their own passion, whether it's their own art, whether it's their own cupcakes, whether it's their own technology, can't pursue something without the veto of the majority. I mean, I think in a democracy, we want to find a room for self-expression that the market, in my view, does do, though needing checks of equality for workers. And I recognize that there's a tension in those two things.
And look, I don't want to overstate the point here, and I don't want to lose a sense of perspective, because I do realize that the person I was talking to in that clip is, I mean, my God, relative to American politicians, is like in the 99th percentile of, certainly at that level of influence and debate in Congress, is in the 99th percentile good positions on this. I think given the current state of the Overton window, if I think achieving the kind of codetermination reforms that he's talking about would be a giant step in the right direction, and even that would be a huge struggle. I mean, my God, imagine what the pushback would look like, if there's a serious attempt to to do that. But I also think that there is a very basic philosophical divide here, because I understand that right now in the world of 2025, most people, not most viewers of this show, but most people, when they hear sort of Khanna given the anti-socialist part of his case, the sort of like, okay, this is why, yeah, he wants to go, many steps that I like in the right direction, but he wants to stop far short of socialism. And he's sort of explaining, here's why I want to stop at social democracy and not go all the way to socialism. That the kinds of things he says about the freedom of individuals to have their vision realized, having to run it by a collective, are the kinds of things that most Americans would nod along to. I think that as much as like there is encouraging evidence that that you can get together a majority coalition for all kinds of good social democratic things, et cetera, et cetera. I understand that we have not won that ideological war yet, with the general population. But my very basic objection to this is a really, really simple one. And it's just basic egalitarianism. That, look, if you think everybody counts the same, why are we concerned with the freedom of business owners to have their vision and goals and dreams implemented without having to run it by a collective? And we're not equally interested in every other human being's ability to implement their goals, dreams, etc., which is denied to the precise extent that they are denied a say in what goes on in the workplace, that they're denied control over the place that they have to spend so much of their lives, as the congressman himself said. And I think once you really internalize that sort of deeper egalitarianism, that it's like, yeah, sure, if we're just focused on one set of individuals, this can sound pretty good. People should be able to achieve their dreams without, other people getting veto power over it. But if what you really mean is people should be able to have their dreams implemented by other people who are forced by economic circumstances to be there and to follow orders, and those other people shouldn't have a say in accordance with their own dreams about which dreams they want to be implemented on the job, I think that is a real failure of democratic equality. And, we were talking earlier in the show about the 19th century and sort of, older struggles for democracy. And if you think about the sort of view of liberal constitutional monarchists of previous eras, people who would say, oh, I don't want to go as far as these crazy radicals who want a republic, but sure, I want to reform the status quo in all sorts of ways, right? I think that, maybe a third of parliament should be made up of elected representatives of the people, not hereditary nobles, because it's important that the people have some say, so there's some balance there. Or sure, I think that the king's power should be limited in all sorts of ways, so he can't tyrannize us. But I mean, he's still the king. He's still the rightful holder of the throne. So I still think he should have a lot of power over domestic and foreign policy. The way that we look back on those views from the vantage point of the 21st century, maybe the way that in future centuries people look back on this advocacy of this kind of halfway house of progressive capitalism, or at least I really, really hope so. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.